Thank you all for standing by. Titled Adaptation, the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impact. Our initiative of the Ohio State University Climate Change Outreach Team, a multi-departmental effort within the university led by OSU Extension, Ohio Sea Grant, Bird Polar Research Center, several other OSU departments to help localize the climate change issue for Ohioans and Great Lakes residents. I am Jill Gentis-Banicki from Ohio Sea Grant and Stone Laboratory, and joining me today is Dan Vimont and David Liebl. Dr. Vimont is Associate Professor of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences at the University of Wisconsin and is a Bryson Distinguished Professor of Climate, People, and the Environment. He conducts both fundamental and applied climate research. One focus area of his research includes assessing regional impacts of climate change. He serves as the co-chair of the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts Science Council and the initiative's Climate Working Group. Dr. David Liebl is a statewide outreach specialist for the University of Wisconsin Cooperative Extension. He is a member of the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impact Science Council and co-chairs the Initiative Stormwater Working Group. As a faculty associate in the University of Wisconsin's College of Engineering, he is working directly with Wisconsin coastal communities to identify climate-related stormwater vulnerabilities and adaptation strategies. We're delighted to have both of them here today to talk a little bit about a great Wisconsin initiative. But before we do that, a few logistical issues as we get started. During our presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. Afterwards, I will conduct a question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, please feel free to use the chat feature located on the right-hand side of your screen, and I will collect and pose your questions out to Dr. Vimont and David Liebl at the end of their presentations. We have more than 100 participants so far on this webinar, a great diverse group representing governmental agencies, academia, and nonprofit groups from the Great Lakes and around the country. Please keep the questions coming throughout the presentation, and we should have a great Q&A session. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted onto our website for later viewing. Also, we will post a webinar survey in the chat feature toward the end of the hour. Please take a few minutes after the webinar to fill that out. It will help us continue to bring you better webinars. So without any further delay, I'd like to introduce Dr. Dan Vimont and David Liebl from the University of Wisconsin, who will present the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts. Now, I'm going to give both of you the ball.
Okay.
And so you should have that now. And one thing I wanted to mention to everybody, just so you can see the chat, if you go up to the upper portion of your screen, you should be able to see viewing Vimont and Liebl's desktop. If you just wave over that, you should click onto the chat, and you'll be able to then ask questions to them a lot easier. So if you all could do that, that'd be great. And I think we're all set.
All right. This is Dan Vimont, and David and I are very happy to be able to present some of the history of Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts and some of the things that we've been doing with WICCI. So thanks to everyone for attending, and also acknowledgments to a number of individuals within WICCI who we're going to be showing results from. There's too many to name by name, but really this is an effort of hundreds of individuals. It's not just us, obviously. So today I'm going to talk about, let's see here, the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts, and I'm going to discuss some of the history of WICCI, and then we'll talk about some of its accomplishments, and then talk about where we're going from here. And the intent of this is to kind of just share the stories of how we got going. I know there's probably a number of similar efforts going on around the country, and we've we've had some successes and some lessons learned, and so this is a good opportunity to share those. So to begin with, I want to start off with the history of the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts. So we'll kind of go through this first part via the chronology here. So WICCI began in 2007, and two things occurred in the summer of 2007. One, a group of individuals from the Nelson Institute here at University of Wisconsin met with legislators here in Wisconsin. I think Mark Miller and Spencer Black, I think, were the individuals that they were meeting with to talk about climate change. And the question came up, what does climate change mean for my constituents? I think we're used to thinking about climate change in terms of global impacts, and it's a very hard question to answer. The second thing that happened was the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources recognized that a lot of their management policies would depend on how climate is going to change over the next few decades. And so they contacted the Nelson Institute as well to talk about how to incorporate climate information into some of their science and management issues. And so in summer 2007, there was a meeting held between the DNR and the Wisconsin DNR and the UW Nelson Institute to just discuss climate change and natural resource management. And as a result of that meeting, that was in June, there was a series of meetings over the summer then to put together some kind of an effort to understand climate change impacts. And the initial so after that first meeting, literally the few days after that, a draft charter was written for what would eventually become WICCI. And the charter literally read, first of all, climate scientists will tell us what the climate is going to be like in mid-century. Then we'll ship that information to people who are studying impacts, and they'll use that to understand how climate change will impact various systems. And then we'll ship that to decision makers, and they'll make good decisions based on that. And there was a fourth part there as well, which I don't recall at this point, but probably involved sitting around eating apple pie and vanilla ice cream and talking about how good it all worked. But that was not what that was not the model that we adopted. And about 5 minutes after that came out, Chris Kucharik, who's now the Department of Agronomy here, called up, and we decided that we should change the organization. So a series of meetings occurred from then on out, and we came up with a structure for WICCI that was more of a collaboration. And I take very little responsibility for this structure. There was a group of people that got together, and the idea is that climate impacts is not a linear process. It really requires a conversation. And so over the summer, an organization was put together, and we came up with the idea of a science council and I think an advisory committee at that point. And I don't know whether the working groups, whether that idea had come up at that point or not. But we came up with the names of individuals that would potentially populate the science council to understand how climate change would affect Wisconsin. And actually, I'll get to that in just a second here. Sorry. So the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts was kind of dreamt up in summer 2007 with a three-part mission, which still sounds very linear, but the organization was not. And the mission then is to assess and anticipate climate change impacts in Wisconsin, to evaluate the effects on human activities, and then to develop and recommend adaptation strategies. And we've since modified that, and I'll talk about that when we get into future directions. So, WICCI kind of moved forward with this idea that, with a message that our climate has changed and will continue to change, and how will we adapt? The goal of WICCI initially was to incorporate a wide audience in there. We recognized that this is not just a scientific problem. We needed decision makers that include scientists at state and federal agencies, managers for natural resource managers and other managers, governments, local, state, and tribal governments, and then a number of other NGOs, etc. So a broad audience. And so WICCI was formed as a boundary organization to bring all of these different audiences together. After that summer, then, the Science Council was organized, and we sent out letters to 14 individuals around the state, hoping we'd get about a 50 to 60% return rate of yeses. So we'd have a group of maybe 8 to 10 individuals. And 14 letters were sent out asking people to be part of the WICCI Science Council, which involved half-day meetings once a month in Madison, potentially traveling across the state with no end in sight. And every single person that we sent a letter to wrote back saying yes, they wanted to be a part of it. And that's one of the lessons learned, I think, as well. We'll talk about that in a bit, that it was a very engaged group of individuals to begin with. So the Science Council also spans a wide variety of disciplines and interests, from the University of Wisconsin system, Madison, Stevens Point, Milwaukee, Green Bay, etc., to the Department of Natural Resources. And really, the Nelson Institute and the Department of Natural Resources have been primary partners in this since the beginning. But also the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection, DATCAP, Sea Grant, UW Extension, USGS, Department of Health Services, etc. And now our membership is even broader than that, I think. And the goal of the Science Council was to bring people together who could kind of survey the landscape of what was going on related to climate change impacts in the state, and even just to survey the management landscape in the state. The Science Council, in addition to providing leadership, the goal was to identify directions that we should pursue, and then identify individuals who could kind of pursue those. And so the idea of working groups came up, and these working groups are really just smaller collections of individuals who organize around a certain topic. And so as a boundary organization, WICCI sets up these working groups, which are really boundary objects. And as people start convening around these topics, work happens. So the working groups were organized, and in 2000, actually it was, I think in fall 2007, the Climate Working Group was one of the first working groups to get going, and we eventually spun up a whole series of working groups. And so personally, I'm one of the co-chairs of the Wisconsin Climate Working Group, and I did not put together this slide. I'm not a big fan of this slide. It's a little too egocentric, but really, if we were to do this correctly, this would look like spaghetti. There would be lines all over everywhere, as any good, convoluted network would be. But this kind of points out some of the working groups, from place-based working groups like Milwaukee and Green Bay to topic-based like forestry and wildlife, and et cetera. And the idea is that these working groups focus on a particular area, and they interact with other working groups as appropriate. Certainly forestry and wildlife, or plant and natural communities and wildlife would have strong connections. So the advantage of doing this is that you're not tackling the whole problem at once. You're spinning up these boundary objects that are small chunks that people can gather around. And so each of these working groups would include a variety of individuals, from researchers to managers to extension agents and so forth. And the idea was to identify vulnerability to climate change and summarize existing information about how climate change affects these various areas or topic areas, and to identify research needs. The Science Council then could synthesize this information and inform other working groups and so forth. So what we see here is the development of sort of a big communication network here, where individual working groups are identifying needs for information and bringing that to WICCI as a whole, and WICCI as a whole is identifying how to communicate between different groups. At the same time, we had decided that an advisory committee would be a good idea, and the advisory committee, the role of the advisory committee was two things at that time. One was to sort of establish WICCI as an organization that sits at the boundary between science and policy. The Science Council obviously is mostly science, development of science, and in order to be relevant, then we needed to ensure that the stakeholders who would be using this information were represented and had a voice in this. And so membership here, there's a whole series. You can see the list of the variety of different organizations that are represented on the advisory council. Represents business interests, non-governmental organizations, various agencies, and et cetera. And the idea was to survey the landscape of stakeholders as well as the landscape of science that needed to be represented. And at the same time, shortly thereafter, the Outreach Roundtable was organized. And the Outreach Roundtable, David actually is one of the co-chairs of this, and he'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit. But the Outreach Roundtable also involves a number of different sectors, I guess, NGOs, different agencies, academic agencies, and then UW Extension. UW Extension has been a big part of that. And the idea there was to bring was twofold. It was not just to bring science from WICCI out to the public. It was also to assess needs of various organizations and various and of the public, and bring that back to WICCI. And so the outreach group here is really key. It's not just a one-way information transfer. It's bringing information back to the network and informing the direction that WICCI will evolve. And that's really important, I think. So this kind of went along, and then in 2011, we completed WICCI's first assessment report, Wisconsin's Changing Climate Impacts and Adaptation. It was about a 200-page report, which summarizes the results of, I'd say, WICCI Phase 1, which is primarily the first part of those three parts of the initial WICCI mission, which is to understand climate change impacts to assess and anticipate climate change impacts on specific Wisconsin natural resources. And so this includes the chapters that are listed here, climate adaptation, various impacts, and then different strategies for moving forward. So that was released in 2011, and that, I think in retrospect, we look back on that and kind of think of that as kind of the conclusion of WICCI Phase 1. So at this point, and I should also mention here in the chronology here, so in 2007, this was a few of us sitting around the table, and then by 2011, the release of Wisconsin's Changing Climate, there were, I think, over 250 individuals contributing to this report in some way or another, so contributing to various working groups. So WICCI grew really fast, and one of the which is a good thing, but it has also introduced new challenges. So I think WICCI's early success, David and I were brainstorming about some of the reasons for WICCI's early success, you're getting a biased view of this. We're just talking about the successes. There's areas we certainly need to improve, and we'll address that as well. But One of the reasons was Science Council members were engaged, and a lot of them were already working on climate change. So we didn't have to convince people that this was an important thing to get involved with. And as I said earlier, not only were they already working on it, but they were eager to get involved in this project. The working groups. The working groups, I think, was a good idea. When you set up these small, tractable problems, and the way we set up these working groups is we identified individuals who could be champions of these working groups and get these groups started. And so that usually involves identifying some sort of work that's already underway. And sometimes that work involved climate change impacts already, such as the forestry working group, which really built upon certainly the northern Wisconsin contribution to the forestry working group, really built upon what was going on up at the Northern Institute for Applied Climate Sciences, the stuff that Chris Swanson and Maria Janowiak and colleagues up there had developed with their climate change response framework and so forth. So in that case, we could capitalize on existing efforts, and they could also capitalize on the downscaled data and the information that we produced. Other working groups weren't already thinking about climate change. And while they may have been thinking about it, but it wasn't a major focus, and such as the stormwater working group, which was built on practitioner training. And so, but again, it was an existing effort where they saw that there was utility in thinking about climate change. So capitalizing on existing efforts was really useful. Two things that we think were really important in getting kind of buy-in from public and et cetera was, one was the historic data analysis. And this was stuff that Chris Kucharik had done that had completed right as WICCI was getting going. And what it allowed us to do was, let me just see if this, what it allowed us to do was to go out and say, okay, climate is changing in Wisconsin. And whether or not that's due to anthropogenic emissions of carbon dioxide or not, is almost secondary to the point that when people recognize that there are variations in climate over long time scales, they recognize that that this is kind of real. The third thing was the production of downscaled climate projections. After the historic data analysis, we submitted a grant proposal to the Wisconsin Focus on Energy program, which allowed us to construct some downscaled projections of climate change in Wisconsin. And those downscaled projections really occurred based on conversations between climate scientists and people who are going to use the information. So what that means is that the downscaled projections were relevant. We developed a methodology. In fact, the initial methodology that we proposed, we scrapped literally half an hour into starting the project, and we started over from scratch, developing a new methodology that would meet the needs of the people who are going to use the data. And I'll show in a moment here, those downscale projections are now available for the entire eastern U.S., and so that's not a, if anybody wants that information, they can contact us, and we're happy to share that. As I've said, we really capitalized on what was already going on, and what that meant is that we could build a big network very quickly. And so WICCI was designed under this idea of adaptive management, and we developed a decentralized organization. No one was mandating what we did, and no one said, okay, you have to, we're not going to deal with this certain, with forestry because someone else is. We thought, let's just expand as sort of organically. That's really powerful as an organization because it means that when you develop the network, the individual research projects going on recognize the utility of the collaboration, and it's easy to join in and see how that's going to benefit different individuals. This is, I think, probably WICCI's biggest strength is the fact that it is very decentralized. But it is also one of the major weaknesses in moving forward, and I'll talk about that as well in a moment. And then we're, as I said earlier, we're very inclusive of emerging issues and ongoing research. We just capitalize on what's already going on. The other thing I want to point out here is that WICCI has a very flat hierarchy. This decentralization is that way, which means that there's no, it's tough to sort of grandstand, which is good because it means that that people recognize the utility of contributions from areas outside their own research. Okay, so I want to talk about some of the accomplishments of WICCI in that first phase and since then. And one of the accomplishments I'd say is the statistically downscaled climate projections here. Initially, these were for Wisconsin alone, but we got a grant from the Upper Midwest and Great Lakes Landscape Conservation Cooperative to extend that downscaled data to the Upper Midwest and Great Lakes region, which is this blue region on the map that's shown here. And when we started doing that work, we took a look at that region and said, there's all these other landscape conservation cooperatives that are right across, these borders here. And as soon as that data is available in the blue region, they might want a little information just to extend into theirs. It makes sense that that would be the case. And so it was we iterated back and forth, and it was suggested that we produce information for all the LCC regions that intersect, I think, with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Region 5. And when we looked at that, we ended up essentially downscaling the entire eastern U.S. because there was only Florida and a little bit of Maine that was cut off. And so we decided, all right, we'll just do the entire eastern U.S. We'll avoid the complications of downscaling in mountainous regions and so forth. So that data is now available. And here's some results from that. This is just zoomed in on the northeastern U.S. here. So this is a projected climate change from 13 different climate models. It shows that the average temperature should warm by about 6 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-century, according to those models. And one of the things that we did was, instead of just producing maps of the mean change, we produced the range of possible change. And that's been really important. I'll give an example of that in 2 seconds. That's been really important in terms of looking at impacts. The other thing, our climate data, it was identified that events were very important, and information about events were important. And so we have information on things like the number of days that exceed 90 degrees Fahrenheit, or number of 2-inch precipitation events or greater during a 10-year period. And we tried to make sure that the statistics of the climate data, of the daily data, were very well represented. And so that's what we're undertaking right now. This data is available if anybody wants it. I want to give an example of why the range is important. So for Wisconsin, we found that the warming for Wisconsin during summertime is somewhere between 3 and 8 degrees Fahrenheit. And 3 is the 10th percentile, 8 is the 90th percentile, and in the middle is about 6. And what that means, that was used, that's very useful for a risk assessment. Here's an example of that, and this is from Matt Mitro and John Lyons and Janice Stewart, who produced these maps of streams that currently, or the streams that support brook trout. And so all the blue streams here are streams in the current climate that support brook trout populations. When streams get too warm, brook trout start dying off. And so here's current climate, brook trout and brown trout habitat. And they use that range in the following way. If you increase air temperature by the low end of that range, which is about 1 degree Celsius, then 44% of brook trout habitat in the state is gone. And if you increase it by the mid-range, 3 degrees Celsius, then 94% of brook trout habitat in the state is gone. And if you increase it by the high end of that range, then brook trout habitat is essentially missing from the state. And even brown trout habitat is largely missing from the state. This is now being used in conversations between the DNR and people in the Driftless area, which is southwestern Wisconsin here, in the DNR's master planning to identify what land tracts should be, or land purchases that should be made, and management strategies for that area. So this information is now in addition to the conversation between climate scientists and impact scientists, it's now extending to the population to just to identify how management can be improved in the area. I'm going to turn this over to David here, who's going to talk about the outreach and engagement here.
Thanks, Dan. Hi, everybody. This is David Liebl. As Jill mentioned in the beginning, I've been with WICCI for quite a number of years, co-chairing the Stormwater Working Group with Ken Potter and co-chairing the Outreach Roundtable. And one of the things that Dan emphasized early on, which I think is important to keep in mind, is the two-way street that we have working with stakeholders on climate change, that not only are we providing good information to help them with understanding climate change and perhaps doing some planning around it, but we hear back from them about the aspects of climate change that have the most impact on their lives and what type of information they're going to find most useful. So we've spent a lot of time trying to develop a large network of collaborative organizations that participate as stakeholders in the group. And this is just a long list of the organizational collaborators that have been engaged either as Science Council members, working group members, engaged in programs that we have done on climate change and so forth. Primarily, these are folks that are looking at making some type of management decision related to climate change, and it's only recently that we've been working more directly with the public on some of these topics. I've got a chart here that is a little bit complicated, but if you bear with me, I think it does a good job of showing how information flow and feedback works in our flat organizational structure. Obviously, the working groups are the science engine for WICCI, with the Science Council providing guidance and vetting for the information that then is used for outreach and communications. And we have several categories of communications and outreach that we regularly use as part of our organization. And then our partnerships are probably the most important conduit for that information. And here we see the groups that we've been working with that have been most active in the outreach and communications aspect of WICCI. And through the university, which is a major partner, we have engaged centers and departments and scientific initiatives on the climate issue. And through the University of Wisconsin Extension, which is a statewide organization, we have also a variety of organizational partners that can take WICCI's information and then disseminate it out into a broader audience. And the impacts from these groups are both Wisconsin and regional, depending on which. And we found that this has been a really effective approach to taking our message out to where it can do the most good. And then because all of these organizations are also involved in WICCI internal activities, whether it's working groups or the Science Council, we're hearing back regularly on how effective those communications are and what we need to do to either improve the approach we're taking or to come up with customized information for a particular need. Outreach messages, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the approaches that we're taking, and we've really tried to cover all the bases, whether it's scientific publications or posters at conferences, popular press, and talks around the state. Much of what we do is to work in a more collaborative approach. These are some examples of workshops that we have run with the Department of Natural Resources, training natural resource managers on climate risk and impacts, different communities and professional organizations. We did a series of workshops with NOAA and the Great Lakes Sea Grant programs on climate impacts to coastal communities. All of these have really focused on helping stakeholders to understand what they might expect from the changing climate, and then how to calibrate their time scale for the decisions that they make as they look at vulnerabilities and adaptation strategies. Working with UW Extension, we look at this as a particularly powerful outreach tool. Bill Bland and I, who is also on the Wiki Science Council and a member of UW Extension and the Department of Agriculture here, have been going around the state holding training sessions for UW Extension county faculty, helping them understand the climate issues and how they might work with their communities directly on climate planning and adaptation. And the focus that we're trying to move forward with here is the concept of climate-ready communities. That climate, in this case, a community has developed some awareness about climate impacts and projections. They've done a vulnerability assessment looking at issues like heat waves, drought management, extreme rainfall. How will that affect their community, and then what can they do in terms of planning and developing resiliency? And we've had some good initial success working with the city of La Crosse, and we are going to talk a little bit more about a countywide program that we're doing in a few minutes. But one of the approaches that we're taking that seems to be working very successfully is to emphasize the fact that weather is very variable. There's a lot of variability in climate, that many of the extremes that communities look at as a risk or a disaster are rare, but if they are prepared for them now, they should be prepared for the type of variability that we're expecting to see in climate as time progresses. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Dan, and we'll go back and forth here for the last section on future directions.
Thanks. It's Dan again. After the first assessment report, WICCI kind of moved into its what we're calling phase 2. We recognized a number of challenges that were kind of unique. One is the decentralized structure, as I mentioned earlier, is a real strength of WICCI. It allows us to adapt in the organization to adapt in new directions, to move in new directions very easily, to take advantage of new areas of research and so forth. And the downside of the very highly decentralized structure is that it is very difficult to fund a centralized component of that. And an example of this is Wikipedia. Right, every few months, Wikipedia passes the hat. Right, it's a very decentralized organization, and Wikimedia is what makes Wikipedia possible by providing the infrastructure. And we recognize that we need a similar centralized component in Wiki. That's really hard to do for a number of reasons, centered for a number of reasons. Maintaining the collaborative network, again, one of the strengths of Wiki is that it provides an opportunity to communicate information between a wide variety of different sectors, individuals, etc. But that requires, again, some sort of centralized communication network, and maintaining that is again difficult. Also, building that network is important. Planning for adaptation. I'm going to let David talk quickly about this one. We're definitely tag teaming here.
So one of the things that we're finding when we work with different stakeholder groups is that climate projections out to mid or late century are not always relevant to the planning horizon of this particular stakeholder. So local governments, for example, might be planning 2 to 4 years out on their next budget cycle, and what does climate mean to them. And so we need to find a way to make this relevant to the people that are planning longer term than otherwise might be the case. And so a lot of that also is tied to effectively communicating climate risk, and we really want people to integrate their thinking about planning and change and vulnerability to include climate without sort of jumping off the diving board and investing huge sums of money and then being vulnerable to the variability that we have embedded in our climate projections.
So we recently completed a strategic planning process, and as part of this, we kind of thought about how to address some of the needs and the challenges that WICCI is facing. And part of that, as part of that, we redid our mission statement. So remember, our original mission statement was to assess and anticipate climate change, and then so that's number one. Two was to see how it affects humans, essentially. And then number three was to develop and recommend adaptation strategies. We've recognized that third component is really outside of our jurisdiction, I guess, if you want to call it that. And that really what we should be doing is enabling others to do the same by developing these climate-ready communities or a sense of climate awareness. Then as people make decisions, they're able to incorporate climate information where it's relevant. And so our mission was changed to generate and share information that can limit vulnerability to climate change in Wisconsin and the upper Midwest. The other thing we've done is we've recognized that the borders of Wisconsin are somewhat arbitrary, and we're very much looking forward to working with partners in the region and really across the U.S. in doing this. And certainly our downscaled data represents much broader than just the upper Midwest. So some of the things that we're looking forward to in phase two, one, taking a multifaceted approach to building collaborations. So again, we've been talking about surveying the landscape of management and the landscape of stakeholders. And in order to do that, it really requires a multifaceted approach in identifying what's important. So the approach we're taking is to maintain the advantage of the decentralized network, the ability to quickly adapt and to survey new regions and so forth. But at the same time, we recognize the importance of a centralized component of WICCI that does stuff like synthesizing what's going on in the very diverse network and provides a communication structure and so forth. And we're really focusing on we're trying to elevate the role of these working groups, these different, I guess, nodes of this big network in driving the agenda here. So allowing the autonomy of the working groups to let the organization evolve. At the same time, we are recognizing we need to identify new issues. Two of them that were brought up after the first assessment report. When we published the first assessment report, we had a big working group meeting, and we surveyed WICCI and said, what are we missing? And two things that really came up were what's referred to as economics, and in that case, it's the sort of monetary impacts of climate change. Although if there's any economists out there, they're probably cringing at us referring to economics as that. But and then also adaptation science, thinking about how people actually use the information. The other thing that we're looking forward to doing is expanding the stakeholder network and growing this network in some way. Some areas of our network will sunset, and other areas will emerge. And the advantage of the decentralized network is we can do that really easily. So two areas that we're hoping to push forward are a driftless area working group, which will require communication, I think, in a 4-state region rather than just Wisconsin, but that's emerging. And a Northern Forests Initiative in partnership with NIAX and other efforts up there with the tribal efforts and so forth. And then, as I stated, new collaborations beyond Wisconsin. We're recognizing the importance of moving beyond just Wisconsin. So our organization, one of the big things that we've done is this seems kind of, this may not seem like a big deal, but this actually is a really big deal, is changing our organizational structure from this to this. Now, if those don't look too different, that's because they all have the same colors and so forth. But what we're trying to do here is the top 3 boxes there represent, especially the middle box, represent this gigantic decentralized network that's just embedded within the the social and ecological landscape of climate impacts in the state. And all the working groups, the little boxes there represent the working groups that contribute to this this organization here. And what we're doing is we're recasting our Science Council as a network of working groups to really allow that communication structure between the working groups to occur organically and to allow that information transfer. At the same time, we're recognizing that you really have to survey this complex landscape in a variety of different ways. And so we maintain a Science Advisory Council, which can look at emerging trends in federal funding or in efforts around the region. And we're also incorporating a Stakeholder Advisory Council, which looks at needs from a stakeholder point of view. That's all relatively decentralized. We're also generating a centralized network that's a coordinating team. Now, the importance of the centralized network is not that it directs WICCI, but that it represents or speaks on behalf of what's going on in WICCI. So again, it's not a directing role. It allows that decentralization to continue. Here's David again, quickly.
So along with this new organization, we're also moving our focus more out into the public realm than we had in the past. Previously, we've been working primarily with regulatory, state organizations, professional organizations, and so forth, people that were resource managers. But we're recognizing that communities need to get engaged on climate for a variety of reasons, and so we're looking at working in making climate a relevant issue to local government. And we've just initiated a project with Dane County, Wisconsin, where we are bringing together all the managers from the county government to look at what their potential vulnerability and risk is to climate change using the downscaled climate projections that Dan showed you a little bit earlier. And then can we develop some type of countywide adaptation strategy? As we work our way through this pilot project, we're going to be transferring those outcomes to other communities in the UW's extension network, and then regionally and nationally as well.
All right, and then the sort of closing statement here is thinking more broadly of WICCI and WICCI's role in a sustainable future. One of the things that we're recognizing is that WICCI is really just one part of developing sustainability in the region. And in doing so, it really helps to recognize that sustainability is not an equilibrium end state. In these complex adaptive networks, they're always changing. There's never an end state that everyone just sits around and says, oh, great, we're done. And so that means that sustainability really isn't about developing the end state. It's developing a process by which knowledge is generated. It's communicated with individuals individuals and organizations. There's an assessment of how useful that knowledge is, and then that process feeds back to the knowledge generation and to the network itself. And WICCI is designed as an organization to characterize that feedback. The other thing we recognize is that in reality, climate adaptation is usually not the most pressing consideration. And in a lot of cases, climate adaptation just isn't. You don't need to change everything you're doing just because climate is changing on a 30 to 40-year time scale. But a lot of times, if you fail to consider climate change, then the decisions you're making on a short time scale lead you along a path along which climate change may eventually end up being disastrous. And so by preparing climate-ready communities or climate awareness that allows people to incorporate climate information into their day-to-day decision-making processes and make better decisions as a result. And so WICCI's role in all of this is to produce information that enables this process to occur, enables climate adaptation that's sustainable. With that, we'll conclude. So thank you everyone for listening, and if you have questions, feel free and I think type them in, and we'll look forward to corresponding with you in the future.
Great, thank you, both of you. This was really a very interesting presentation, and we've gotten quite a few questions. So let me just get started, and we will see how many we can get through, and we'll try not to go over 1 o'clock. And so let me get started with a few. We had several people really talk or ask about your outreach component in your initiative. They were very impressed with the fact that outreach is such a strong component, that two-way street approach. Could you talk a bit about what needs did the outreach group bring to WICCI, and what specifically did your stakeholders feel were important issues?
One of the things that Dan and I are huddling here together, but one of the things that really came back to us is the notion that extreme weather events, whether it's stormwater runoff or heat waves or winter storms or whatever, are the things that people really relate to when they think about climate. And even though climatologists may be thinking about 30-year averages for a given location, when you talk to someone about climate change, it's usually the most recent extreme weather event that makes the impression on them. And so what we've been able to do then is to incorporate information about how extreme events might change into the future when we communicate about climate trends, to make that relate to the way that people are thinking.
Let me just add something really quickly there too, as the climate scientist here. And David mentioned this earlier, and this is not a new concept. The idea that by building resilience to climate variations like extreme events now, you're also oftentimes building resilience to future climate change, and that's something that I think recognizing the importance of these events, like a summer of drought or a flooding event or something like that. You can talk about historically how frequently these have occurred. You can talk about how they might change in the future. And that conversation really drives a conversation about how to change infrastructure in a way that's beneficial in general, not necessarily just for climate adaptation, but just in general.
Great. Another question we had was, were there also collaborations with Canadian groups?
Yes, to a certain extent. We have talked with, some groups in Manitoba about WICCI and how to kind of do similar sorts of things in that region. We have not. We haven't done as much as we probably could, obviously. Oh yeah, and then Toronto, of course, we're providing climate data to individuals in Toronto, and a lot of our downscaled data extends up there, and so we are providing that information to them. Our downscaled data is available to, let me see if I have I'll just quickly go back to that region, and then just to let people know. There we go. So this region here is where our downscaled data is available. We didn't go too far into Canada because once you get north of that region, the network gets pretty sparse, and so it's hard to justify some of the downscaling techniques. But a lot of the population is covered in that region, so we're happy to share that data.
Actually, could you, we've gotten quite a few questions asking about where they can find that data. Can you put up the URL that you...
So it's at the bottom of the slide.
Okay.
And we've provided a PDF of the slides from this that I believe, Jill, you're going to put up on your website so people can download. Yeah.
Yeah, the PowerPoint slides will be available so you can take a look.
Can I make an additional comment here?
Sure.
So there are a series of maps that are available on the bottom left URL there. there's a series of maps, not just the ones we're showing here, but over the whole region, and a whole bunch of different potential impacts. And then the bottom right, I've made a series of maps that are they're just images. You're welcome to grab those. They're over the region that's shown right here. And we're currently working on developing a web-based resource. There's two ways you can. There's actually two ways you can currently get the data. One is the USGS data portal, I believe, and the other way is if you want all the data, it's about half a terabyte. So the quickest way to do it is to mail us a hard drive, and we can dump the data onto a hard drive and mail it back to you. That may not be the most efficient way for you to use the data, though, unless you're really comfortable using, sorting through half a terabyte of netCDF files. It might make more sense to have a conversation with us at some point. The other way to get the data is going to be, we're developing a web-based resource where you'll be able to upload a shapefile, or you'll be able to, set a region, and we'll produce a whole series of information from the data based on that. That should be ready by the end of summer, I'm guessing.
So just adding on to that, one thing that's important, you'll notice looking at these slides that the regions that are defined for temperature and precipitation and so forth are fairly broad, generally parts of a state. And stakeholders really would like to have that information downscaled to a county or to a city. And we're really cautious about doing that because we don't think that that is actually realistic from a data projection standpoint, and we don't want people making assumptions based on that small geographic area.
David, actually that is a question that several people were asking, is how small can a regional downscaled climate projection be made, and what level of uncertainty is associated with these smaller scale projections?
I would say there's a lot of uncertainty associated as you get to really, really small scales. The thing I want to really caution on here is that oftentimes, like you look at that upper left panel that's shown here, and it says the average temperature is going to increase by about 6 degrees Fahrenheit or whatnot. That's just the average across a whole series of models. There's natural variability, there's uncertainty in physical parameterizations, there's all kinds there's a range of what could occur. And I really want to caution against using one model or against using one scenario or one number. You really should be using a range of possibilities, and that's what we're trying to do with our on the upper right panel there, where we see a distribution of what could occur. So instead of saying that climate in Ohio, that one was done for Ohio. We can do it for any region in our map there. And what it says is that rather than saying climate will warm by 5.73625 whatever degrees, it says climate's going to warm by somewhere between 3 and 9 degrees Fahrenheit if you take a 20-year average. And we've tried to make that range representative, but that range then allows you to really think about the scale and the scope of the impacts. So I want to, when you start looking at that range, that's going to change a little bit over Wisconsin. Instead of 3 to 9 degrees over just all of Wisconsin, maybe it's 3.2 to 9.4 over northern Wisconsin or something. But those tiny numbers really don't make that much of a difference compared to the range of natural variability and of projections and physical uncertainty and so forth. So here's David again.
So when we're talking with stakeholders, one of the ways that we put it is it's more important to understand that all the models are showing warming trends than it is to think that you've got an actual number that you can plan around.
Okay, thanks, David and Dan. A couple other questions that we had, and this is specifically dealing with your model. So let me and I'm going to literally read it verbatim. Climate downscaling has traditionally concentrated on surface air temperature and precipitation. Have you extended to other variables such as long wave radiation, PBL, stability and depth, cloud cover, realizing that a lot of these have higher amounts of associated uncertainty?
Yes. The downscaled data we have currently is minimum, maximum temperature, daily minimum temperature and maximum temperature, and then mean temperature, daily mean. We have precipitation, and we've used those in all the different scenarios to drive the National Weather Service snow model. So we have things like snow cover, depth, snow depth, melt rate, these sorts of things as well. This is really important for wildlife, especially in the northern states. It may not be as important for, Georgia, but and then we've also developed methodologies. We've used the same methodology, and one of my students, Megan Kirkmeyer, has just completed a project doing wind over the Midwest, so wind speed over the Midwest, where we downscale to that. David Lorenz, who is responsible for most of the downscaling here, has developed methodologies for long wave radiation, cloudiness. Shortwave radiation and cloudiness. Obviously, those two are really closely related. And I believe potentially, I'd have to look, but we have done things like photosynthetically active radiation and evapotranspiration. Those are far more uncertain, and we refer to those as more like class 2 variables rather than class 1 variables, because there is a lot of uncertainty there. There just isn't the observational network to allow us to do that in a really robust way. And the uncertainties from the climate models, especially in terms of cloudiness, are really large. So you want to be real careful with those sorts of things.
Okay, thank you. We had a couple more questions, specifically dealing with almost a replication of this initiative. Would you be able to comment a little bit on the feasibility of adopting your project structure for, say, a large urban city project, or even people were asking about the possibilities of replicating WICCI in other states, specifically some of your lessons learned too?
Yeah.
You're getting a lot of people very interested, wanting to know how they can replicate this.
Yeah, I would say probably the best way would be to give us a call and have a conversation, because it's going to differ quite a bit depending on the state and so forth. In terms of lessons we've learned, I think WICCI has been very successful because, so first of all, the partnership between the University of Wisconsin, what I'll broadly refer to as the Academy, and the Department of Natural Resources and other state organizations has been really important for WICCI. We have an incredibly, I'm just continually impressed by our Department of Natural Resources and the scientists and the DNR and the people who are really driving the agenda there. They understand the importance of climate and resource management. And that doesn't mean politically. I mean, so thinking about these partnerships and who is going to be engaged, who you think is already going to be engaged and could contribute in a positive way, that's really important. The other thing that has really helped WICCI in terms of some of these partnerships is that we have not addressed mitigation. And a lot of people will holler at us for that. But it was a political move that initially, and as it turns out, it's turned out to be a very good move, because when you talk to people about mitigation, that's where all the political hackles get raised and so forth. But when you talk to people about making the best choices related to management of your natural and human resources in the state, then pretty much everybody gets behind that. And so even in on either side of the aisle, people are supportive of this effort. And so that's something you could consider, I think, in that way. In terms of moving forward, it's really going to depend on the kinds of partnerships that you put together and how engaged people are in doing this. So the other thing I'll say here on the decentralized on this is that WICCI has been funded in terms of actual grants for the organization of WICCI. We've received a $60,000 grant from the Baldwin Foundation that has supported WICCI since 2007. Everything else has been either in-kind support or it has been funding individual projects that get spun up from different parts of the network. So it is incredibly difficult to find funding to just support the communication network. But if you can find that funding, you can leverage it. For that $60,000 has spun up several $1 million worth of research and adaptation efforts, and literally several million. I think it's on the order of $8 to $10 million worth of research. You got to, depending on how you do the accounting, right? If you kind of squint your eyes and look sideways at it, then you can come up with that number. But so there is a huge payback of the decentralized network, but the problem is that you need engaged individuals because you're going to run out of personal capital real quick. So, if you're interested in getting this going in another state or something like that, this is what we did with in Manitoba with their efforts there. We went up and we talked to them about what we've done and what they could do to do something similar. But we'd be happy to talk about it.
Thank you. One last question, because we have gotten a lot of people from Wisconsin asking, how do you feel you can keep WICCI going in terms of funding, that kind of thing? What are you hoping? What steps do you feel you need to do to keep WICCI going for a while longer?
That's a good question. One thing I'll do, seeing as we have a broad audience, is that if anybody wants to donate money, we'd love to take it and keep it going that way. So passing the hat is it's worked for Wikipedia. The other thing, to be more realistic about that, and actually we're only partially joking with that statement. The advantage of this very decentralized network is that it does not take much money at all to maintain the network, the communication, and the effort. The idea is that individual nodes in that network, so the Forestry Working Group, will come up with its own funding through its own resources, federal resources or whatnot, and that having WICCI as a network will add strength to those kinds of proposals. So what we're really looking for is a way to maintain the operational costs of WICCI, which are really modest. $100,000 a year would go a very long way. It would, what is that, like quintupling or 10 times what we've been running off so far. The different things we're thinking are, one, expanding regionally, because I think that opens us up to more federal opportunities and to private funding. Another thing that we're looking forward to is, I think in the next couple of years there's going to be more of a market for this kind of stuff. And so instead of spinning up a working group around purely academic endeavors, we'll be able to talk with the business community and say, okay, so climate impacts on energy. Let's talk with some of the energy consortiums or energy groups and say, for a very small investment, on the order of tens of thousands of dollars, we can put together a working group and come up with assessments of how climate change can impact what really matters to you. And I think there's going to be more, so moving kind of towards a consulting role, as long as it stays open and you deal with all that correctly. So we're looking at different routes forward that way. And then the other thing is, I think we have, when I've talked about this, the WICCI and a sustainable future, I think this idea of sustainability is a potential route forward in terms of thinking about kind of exploring new directions and potentially exploring sources of funding related to that. That's I'm not sure whether that's actually going to happen or not. But I mean, WICCI is definitely going to continue forward. We've had a bit of a lull the last year or so with restructuring, but this after the strategic planning process, we have a new strategic plan that'll be unveiled probably this fall. We'll probably have another all hands meeting in fall to unveil the new structure of WICCI. And to think about challenges for the next couple of years. So I'm really optimistic about re-energizing some of these efforts. It's probably been nice for a lot of us to have a little bit of time to sit back a little bit, especially after the effort put into that assessment report. So I'm optimistic about our ability to continue it and to move forward in exciting new directions.
Well, thank you. This has been, I think we've gotten most of the questions asked, and I appreciate the fact both of you were willing to stay on a little longer to answer, although I didn't, I guess, give you the opportunity to leave either. So thank you. This was very, very interesting, and so many people have commented about this, so we really appreciate it. I did want to just kind of go through a little bit of some of our logistics here. I wanted to, again, thank both you, Dan and David, for your willingness to talk to us today about the Wisconsin Initiative. It's really been an excellent discussion, so we want to thank you for that.
Happy to do it.
Yeah, and really thanks to everyone for tuning in. We are looking to develop these relationships around the region and in the U.S. and really, there's no we're all in it together. So we're happy to share what we've learned and then the challenges we're facing. We'd love to hear from you as well.
Great. Well, and I will forward all the information, any kind of contacts that I have gotten from people, specific questions they asked, I'll send to you for some follow-up. So I did want to, again, also thank NOAA, National Sea Grant College Program, and Ohio State University for funding specifically this webinar. I did want to also remind everyone that our survey URL is in the webinar, for this webinar is in the chat feature, so if you could take a few minutes to fill that out. We'd like to get your input as we develop a regional climate site, so if you could take the time, that would be great. I also want to refer everyone to resources and an archive of all the previous webinar presentations, including this one here soon, which are located on our changingclimate.osu.edu website. This webinar series is sponsored by the OSU Climate Change Outreach Team and will continue on Tuesday, May 21st with a presentation by NOAA Coastal Services Center, who will be discussing the economics of green infrastructure. Registration is up in the chat feature, so feel free to register now for the webinar. Again, thank you both Dr. Vimont and David Liebl and all the participants on this webinar. We hope that this was beneficial and hope you'll join us again in the upcoming webinar. Thank you and have a great afternoon. Thanks again, you too.
Thanks, Jill.